What if the silence in our oldest historical records is not an accident of time, but a deliberate architectural choice? What if the sudden, spectacular emergence of the Sumerian civilization, often cited as the dawn of history, was actually the carefully orchestrated curtain call of an entirely different, colossal drama? We stand at the edge of the deepest recorded past, gazing back at the seemingly instantaneous brilliance of Mesopotamia. And the textbooks tell us this is where our story begins. But the keen observer, the one who looks not just at the surviving walls, but at the enormous voids between them, begins to sense a structural imbalance. There is a deep, resonant emptiness in the centuries immediately preceding the Anunnaki's established reign, an emptiness that speaks louder than any surviving inscription. It suggests that our common origin story did not start with a genesis, but with a highly specialized editing process. We are taught that the rise of Sumer was unprecedented, a sudden leap from Neolithic village life to advanced mathematics, celestial cartography, and sophisticated jurisprudence, virtually overnight in geological terms. Yet the very clay tablets that detail the legendary arrival and governance of the Anunnaki, those texts that form the foundation of our understanding of this archaic period, also carry the faint, disturbing echoes of something preceding them. These surviving fragments of cuneiform, meticulously catalogued and stored in museum vaults, are often treated as isolated snapshots. But when viewed as a cohesive, albeit fractured narrative, they paint a portrait of transition, not creation. They suggest an inheritance rather than an invention. The Anunnaki arrived to take possession of something already established, something already vast, complex, and crucially, something that needed to be systematically forgotten for the new regime to take absolute hold. The foundational premise we must confront is simple yet profoundly unsettling. History, as we know it, begins in media res, in the middle of the action. The narrative we possess is merely the second, or perhaps even the third chapter, meticulously scrubbed of its true prologue. Think of the transition from a nearly mythical antediluvian age, characterized by impossible rains and gigantic structures, abruptly collapsing into the flood narrative, and then, immediately, the emergence of the Anunnaki, setting up their governance in meticulously planned city-states like Uruk and Eridu. What happened in that pressurized, terrifying moment of transition, when the waters receded and the new order began to write its own history onto the damp clay? That gap is where the true revelation lies. It is the moment where the names, achievements, and technology of the predecessors were consciously and ruthlessly erased from the memory matrix of the planet, replaced by a new creation myth centered entirely around the incoming rulers. The Sumerian scribes, the very recorders of the Anunnaki saga, were thus also the unwitting custodians of this great, terrible secret. The memory of a highly advanced human or proto-human civilization that was deliberately marginalized, its achievements repurposed, and its entire existence reduced to a vague, unworkable myth of giants and impossible timescales. If this idea that our documented history is fundamentally incomplete, a rewritten script designed for control, resonates deep within your understanding of the world, then I invite you to join this collective act of intellectual archaeology. This is not passive viewing, this is observation, reflection, and the quiet pursuit of truth buried beneath the rubble of millennia. If you feel this structural imbalance in the recorded past, pause for a moment. Consider subscribing to this frequency of inquiry, becoming an observer in this journey, and let me know in the comments by simply typing inheritance if you too sense that the history we were given is merely a convenient abridgment. Your participation fuels the continuation of this deep dive into the textual anomalies. The crucial evidence for this deliberate erasure hides within the structures of the surviving texts themselves, particularly the Sumerian king list. This list, detailing the reigns of rulers both before and after the Great Flood, exhibits a stark, almost surgical break. The reigns of the 8 to 10 pre-flood kings stretch into almost unbelievable epochs, tens of thousands of years for single rulers. These durations are instantly dismissed by modern academia as mythical hyperbole, too fantastic to be taken literally. Yet immediately following the flood, the list abruptly transitions to historically plausible reigns lasting decades, not millennia. We rarely pause to ask, why include the mythical reigns at all if they were merely fabrication? Why risk the credibility of the entire document by appending these impossible numbers? The answer, many believe, is that the Anunnaki, the editors of the new history, could not completely disregard the lineage of the predecessors. They had to acknowledge them, but they had to make them unusable, inaccessible, and incomprehensible to the newly established civilization. By inflating the time spans to ridiculous, impossible lengths, the names of the pre-Anunnaki rulers were preserved, but their achievements and their true connection to the earth were effectively sealed off behind a veil of mathematical impossibility. This process was not merely about forgetting, it was about the architects of amnesia, ensuring that the true technological and spiritual heritage of the preceding world would not be available to those who came after. It was an intellectual quarantine. Imagine a world where the infrastructure, the roads, the power sources, perhaps even the orbital mechanisms, were inherited by a new management team. The new managers, the Anunnaki, needed human labor, the Adamu, to operate the systems, but they absolutely could not afford for the workers to understand the underlying principles or the original builder's intentions. The original blueprints, the true history of the antediluvian era, became the ultimate forbidden knowledge. The surviving Sumerian texts, therefore, function as a cryptic instruction manual for a complex machine whose philosophical and historical context has been entirely redacted. They tell us what was done, but never truly why it was done in the first place, or by whom the original designs were laid out. We find the unsettling suggestion of this preceding world in key phrases and concepts within the tablets. The recurrent mention of the Mia, those mysterious tablets or decrees which symbolize the essential components of Sumerian civilization, everything from kingship and priesthood to sexuality and conflict, were described as being transferred, not created. These Mi were passed down, often stolen or retrieved from distant, dangerous places. This implies that the very foundational structures of their society were relics, remnants of the lost governance. The Anunnaki did not bring civilization to a primitive people. They standardized the application of the remnants of a highly sophisticated, globally integrated system that had just experienced catastrophic failure. Their genius lay not in creation, but in rapid, post-disaster rebranding. And this leads us directly to the most critical line of inquiry, the central theme that permeates the deepest layers of these ancient archives. What exactly did the Sumerian texts reveal about the civilization that was erased? It wasn't just physical structures that vanished under the deluge. It was an entire cosmology, a specific understanding of human potential and planetary cycles that the Anunnaki seemed intent on overriding. The erasure wasn't just historical, it was metaphysical. The texts, particularly those detailing the missions and internal debates of the Anunnaki Council, hint at the profound philosophical threat posed by the original inhabitants. Were they too free, too technologically capable? Did they possess a form of self-governance or spiritual independence that conflicted fundamentally with the hierarchical, resource-driven agenda of the incoming extraterrestrial rulers? The whispers suggest a civilization of extraordinary longevity and peace, characterized by a different relationship with time and matter. Perhaps they mastered cycles of energy renewal that made the mining operations of the Anunnaki unnecessary, or perhaps their understanding of consciousness rendered the control mechanisms implemented by the new rulers ineffective. The simple act of documenting the Anunnaki's struggles to establish authority and maintain order, battles fought with enigmatic figures and subtle rebellions, is itself a testament to the persistence of the old ways. The war wasn't just against the elements or against rival Anunnaki factions. It was a psychological and cultural war waged against the memory of the planet itself. The Anunnaki rule, therefore, can be viewed as a systematic campaign against planetary memory, a process of imposing a manufactured scarcity of resources, of knowledge, and most importantly, of self-awareness. To ensure the loyalty and malleability of the new workforce, the true lineage had to be severed. They needed to believe they were created from mud and struggle, not that they were the inheritors of an extraordinary self-sustaining past. The challenge for us, as modern observers looking back through this filtered history, is to find the faint signatures of the original programming within the overwritten script. We are hunting for the textual anomalies, those moments where the Sumerian scribes, perhaps out of reverence for the sheer antiquity of the events, allowed a fragment of the truth to slip through the imposed censorship. This is where we focus our attention next. We must delve into the specific narrative units of the king list and the related epic literature, searching for the key words and grammatical structures that point toward the pre-Anunnaki legacy. We seek the precise textual evidence that confirms the existence of highly advanced technology, perhaps even a global network of energy or communication, that predated the establishment of Eridu and Nippur. The next phase of our investigation requires us to move beyond philosophical speculation and into the detailed comparison of specific cuneiform passages. We are about to pull back the dusty veil on the specific lines of text that inadvertently reveal the scope of the erasure, focusing on the terminology used to describe the first ones and the infrastructure they left behind. If you have stayed with this journey, if the cold logic of this historical erasure has anchored in your thoughts, then you are a true seeker of the deep narrative. To continue receiving these detailed explorations, ensure you are subscribed to the channel and activate the notifications. A simple like helps us bring this vital research to others who feel the same structural imbalance in our history. And as we prepare to examine the textual heart of this revelation, please comment below with the phrase, "The first ones knew," as a silent acknowledgement of the history that was suppressed. Now prepare yourself, because the specific Sumerian texts we are about to decode offer startling, undeniable clues to the profound truth of what was wiped clean before the Anunnaki established their reign on Earth. And this is the vital connection we must hold as we transition into the next chapter of this investigation. Is it possible that the greatest secrets of history are not found in what the ancient texts explicitly state, but in the glaring intentional omissions they contain? If we treat the Sumerian tablets, these silent records of epochs past, less like historical documents and more like curated museum exhibits, we quickly notice the meticulously placed velvet rope. There is a period, vast and unsettling, preceding the recognized reign of the Anunnaki, an era which is acknowledged only through a profound and disturbing silence. This is the blank space on the temporal map, and it is precisely where our investigation must linger. When we attempt to chart the timeline of civilizations, we tend to follow the clear, navigable currents of recorded history, the rise of Akkad, the glory of Uruk, the construction of the ziggurats. But lurking beneath this known surface is a submerged landmass, referenced obliquely by the Sumerian king list itself. Consider the startling accounts of the rulers who governed before the deluge, the so-called primeval kings. Their reigns are measured not in decades or centuries, but in vast, almost incomprehensible spans of time, tens of thousands of years for a single ruler. Eridu, Badtibira, Larak, These cities housed figures whose lifespans suggest a fundamentally different relationship with biology, time, or perhaps dimensions themselves. The common conventional explanation dismisses these numbers as mythic hyperbole, a simple effort to convey antiquity. But what if we approach these figures with the cold, unsettling logic of an engineer looking at corrupted data? If the number is wildly, consistently different from all subsequent measurements, it indicates not a lie, but a change in the fundamental units of measurement, or, more critically, a catastrophic alteration in the environment that sustained those long cycles. The Anunnaki arrived, and suddenly lifespans collapsed, falling into the familiar mortal rhythm we recognize today. The sheer longevity of the primeval kings is the most potent lingering echo of the Great Erasure. It suggests a civilization, or a lineage of consciousness, that operated under principles entirely alien to our current epoch. These were not merely powerful humans, they were perhaps the inhabitants of a completely different operating system for existence on Earth. This forces us to reframe the narrative of the Anunnaki arrival. We often picture them descending from the heavens to an empty, primitive world, initiating human civilization from scratch. But the density and complexity of the records hint at something far more nuanced and deeply unsettling. What if the Anunnaki did not start civilization, but rather inherited its remnants, effectively performing a cosmic intellectual property theft? The silence surrounding the era before them suddenly transforms from a mere gap into a powerful indicator of deliberate censorship. Something vital, something intrinsic to the nature of existence during the time of the primeval kings, had to be removed, either because it posed a threat to the new regime, or because its existence would shatter the controlled reality the Anunnaki sought to implement. If we are to truly excavate this forgotten heritage, we must embrace the role of the quiet observer, the temporal detective, seeking out the faint signatures of the predecessors within the established Anunnaki infrastructure. These clues are subtle, woven into the very fabric of Sumerian cosmology. We must ask, what are the telltale signs left by a civilization that achieved staggering temporal stability and then vanished? Perhaps the answer lies in the persistent, almost desperate need Sumerian culture had to record everything, to categorize and list every object, every event, every celestial observation. Was this obsession with inventory not merely cultural zeal, but a subconscious, desperate attempt to hold on to the vestiges of a system of knowledge that was rapidly slipping away, a system that predated the establishment of their new masters? Understanding this erasure requires not just reading the cuneiform, but sensing the weight of the collective forgetting. We are all participating in this process of rediscovery, moving through the layers of enforced amnesia. If these reflections resonate within you, if you feel the weight of this forgotten history pressing upon your own understanding of time, I invite you to join this collective act of remembering. A simple reflection in the comments below can help map the contours of this shared uncertainty, extending our investigation beyond the screen. It is in this shared curiosity, this collaborative search for the truth, that the most enduring revelations are found. Consider subscribing and liking this video, not merely as a gesture of support, but as a silent commitment to continue the journey into the profound unknowns of human origins. The architecture itself whispers of the unseen architects. When we study the precise, almost superhuman alignment of structures like the great ziggurat of Ur, we are confronted with a level of astronomical and geological knowledge that seems to leapfrog the known capabilities of the early Sumerians. The mainstream attributes this solely to the Anunnaki instruction, but what if the blueprint was not created by the newcomers, but simply adapted from the ruins of the predecessors? The technology of the erased era, therefore, might not have been crude or basic, but rather so advanced, so perfectly integrated with the planet's natural resonant frequencies and orbital cycles that it appeared magical or even fundamentally biological. This pre-Anunnaki civilization perhaps did not rely on heavy, industrialized mechanisms, but on a mastery of scalar energy, consciousness, and the harmonization of telluric currents, a science that transcended the need for easily traceable physical remnants. This level of sophistication, being fundamentally non-mechanical, would have been trivially easy to dismantle and render incomprehensible to the succeeding generations merely by altering the energetic grid of the planet. This brings us to the question of cycles and cosmic time, the very axis around which the Anunnaki presence revolves. The primeval kings ruled during an era of deep time, where the Earth itself seemed to be aligned differently. Ancient texts across the globe, not just Sumerian, speak of the Great Year, a vast procession of astronomical shifts that changes the subtle fabric of reality. Did the Anunnaki arrive not randomly, but precisely at the nadir or zenith of a specific cosmic cycle, perhaps the end of the Age of Leo, or the beginning of a specific celestial alignment? Their arrival in this context was not an isolated event, but a scheduled intervention or succession, taking control exactly when the planetary energies were transitioning. The civilization that was erased, the primeval inheritors, might have understood these cycles perfectly, living in harmony with them. The erasure, then, was necessary to break humanity's connection to the larger cosmic clock, trapping us within the artificial, linear time imposed by the new rulers. The concept of return, a key motif in many mythological narratives, becomes terrifyingly relevant here. If there was a beginning marked by an erasure, what signals will mark the end of the Anunnaki-imposed epoch? The metaphor of the Great Flood takes on a new, insidious meaning when viewed through the lens of memory and suppression. The flood, Abzu, was more than just a hydrological disaster. It was an act of cosmic amnesia, a saturation event designed to cleanse the physical record and, more importantly, the collective psychological memory. Water, in esoteric tradition, is the medium of memory. When the entire planet was submerged, the collective memory matrix of the preceding epoch was dissolved, neutralized, and reset. Only fragments carried by specific protected bloodlines or encoded deep within the bedrock survived the mental deluge. Those who remained, the observers, the early successors, were left with a world fundamentally the same in landscape, yet utterly divorced from its own spiritual and technological past. The whisper of the first inheritors persists across multiple cultures. Consider the parallels. The Golden Age of the Greeks, the Satya Yuga of the Hindus, the long-reigned rulers of the early Egyptian dynasties who possessed unparalleled wisdom. All these traditions speak of a time when interaction between the divine and the mortal was seamless, where life was longer and knowledge was innate. These universal echoes suggest that the Sumerian text is not an anomaly, but merely the most detailed administrative record of a global transition. The Sumerians documented the transition of power in bureaucratic detail, while other cultures retained the emotional and philosophical memory of the loss. The common thread is the profound sense of decline and the shift from an era of spiritual mastery to one of physical labor and material obsession. If the knowledge that was erased was primarily spiritual and scientific, a complete understanding of the relationship between consciousness and physics, then the task of the Anunnaki was to replace this deep wisdom with a transactional, labor-based religion. The primeval inheritors were masters of their own destiny. Their successors became servants, tasked with mining the planet's resources. The code of the forgotten sky, referenced in fragments of texts that speak of stellar navigation far beyond simple stargazing, suggests that the pre-Anunnaki mastery lay in controlling the flow of cosmic energy for global infrastructure. Imagine a world powered not by combustion, but by leveraging the movements of Jupiter or the resonance of the Pleiades. That level of interconnected, non-polluting technology would be the first thing a new, exploitative regime would eliminate. The burden of the successors, ourselves included, is this inherited amnesia. We are left with the ruins and the administrative bureaucracy of the new epoch, endlessly attempting to rebuild technology that was once instinctual. The sudden shortening of lifespans was not an accidental byproduct of the flood. It was potentially a design feature of the new reality, ensuring that no single individual could live long enough to witness the entirety of the cosmic cycle, thereby preventing the rediscovery of the original, erased knowledge. The new regime guaranteed its longevity by limiting the memory of its subjects. And so, we arrive at the unfinished tablet, the point where the existing records fade into frustrating ambiguity. We have established the existence of the erasure, identified the hallmarks of the pre-Anunnaki civilization, vast time, innate knowledge, a different physics, but we have not yet named the specific mechanism of their displacement, nor fully deciphered the ultimate purpose of the new regime's restrictive governance. The question remains: what specific knowledge, vital to our understanding of the cosmos and our true origins, did the Anunnaki fear so deeply that they wiped the slate clean and buried the evidence beneath the silt of the Great Flood? This deep knowledge is the next layer of the Sumerian text we must peel back. If this journey into the silent gaps of history captivates you, if you feel the pull of the forgotten truth, then you are exactly where you are meant to be. If you have reached this point, it means the threads of forgotten memory are already stirring within you. I urge you to subscribe to the channel, ensuring you receive the next crucial part of this investigation as soon as it is unearthed. Give this video a like if you value the pursuit of knowledge that challenges the established narrative. And to join the conversation, type the phrase "primeval code" in the comments below. Your contribution helps us map the consciousness of the community seeking these essential, deep truths. Do not stop here. The next part of the decoding process awaits you on screen now, where we will examine the actual linguistic fragments that survived the Great Cleansing, revealing the nature of the knowledge itself that was intentionally lost. What if the silence preceding the known dawn of Sumerian civilization is not merely an absence of records, but the clearest record of all? We have spent countless hours poring over the extant cuneiform, analyzing the meticulous detail of the king lists, the detailed accounting of offerings, and the bureaucratic precision of temple administration, searching for the crack in the narrative. But the true revelation, the secret history that was methodically sealed away, often resides not in what the tablets contain, but in the glaring, almost defiant omission that precedes the official narrative of the Anunnaki's arrival. We are looking for a linguistic shadow, an echo of a time when the heavens were navigated by a different set of divine constellations, and the earth obeyed a protocol established by intelligences that were forced into calculated obsolescence. The very structure of the early texts betrays a jarring discontinuity, a sudden, almost violent transition from an epoch of boundless, unfathomable longevity, the ages of the mythical pre-flood kings whose reigns stretched hundreds of thousands of years, to the sharp, documented human history governed by the 50 names of the Anunnaki. This is not simply mythology blurring into history. It is the sudden imposition of a new temporal standard, a great calibration that redefined the metric of existence itself. We must ask, why the need for such excessive temporal denial? Why attribute reigns that defy astronomical and geological realities, only to abruptly switch to precise annual records once the new administration, guided by Enlil and Enki, took command? This vast, impossible time frame functions less as history and more as a profound narrative burial ground, a deliberate act of intellectual vandalism disguised as divine hyperbole. It suggests that whatever came before required a monumental narrative effort to displace, a concept so sophisticated or pervasive that merely destroying its physical remnants was insufficient. Its very memory had to be rendered absurd, pushed beyond the grasp of rational human thought into the realm of unbelievable fable. This transition point, the moment history trembles and resets, points directly to the core of the Acharasia. It was not a sloppy accident of time or the gradual decay of information. It was a surgical doctrinal removal of context. The earliest sophisticated structures, the architectural marvels whose foundations the Sumerians inherited and repurposed, the ziggurats themselves, might hold the quietest testament to this lost heritage. When we examine the foundational layers of Iana in Uruk, or the subsequent rebuilds at Ur, we encounter building techniques and material tolerances that seem disproportionate to the stated purpose of simple early temple platforms. Were these initial structures truly built by the incoming Anunnaki rulers, or were they inherited and hastily adapted monuments of a previous, more technologically advanced regime? A regime whose understanding of physics and cosmology was deemed incompatible, or perhaps dangerously competitive, with the newly established order. The Anunnaki established their primacy by claiming authorship over creation, yet the foundation beneath their feet often hints at a pre-existing blueprint, an architect's fading signature etched deep beneath the mud and reeds of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. If this subtle restructuring of history resonates with you, if you feel the weight of these vanished epochs pressing down through the millennia, challenging the complacent narratives of conventional archaeology, then consider joining this shared journey of excavation. By clicking the like button and subscribing, you signal your intent to keep these forgotten histories alive in the collective consciousness, allowing the light of inquiry to penetrate the obsidian gaps of memory. Our investigation demands not just passive observation, but active intellectual partnership. This calculated absence is visible in the specific terminology of the Sumerian priesthood. When they speak of me, the divine decrees or laws that governed existence and maintained civilization, they speak of them almost as inherited programs, complex algorithms of cosmic order that were handed over or stolen, not organically created by the current generation of gods. Why the emphasis on transference rather than origination? The mythology surrounding Inanna's acquisition of the me from Enki reads like the securing of highly valuable intellectual property, a necessary administrative step to solidify the new regime's control. The me, therefore, might represent the distilled, operational fragments of the pre-Anunnaki order, stripped of their original philosophical and cosmological framework, and repurposed for the governance of the new, genetically engineered workforce. Humankind. The complex knowledge base that defined the previous civilization was too valuable to destroy entirely, but too dangerous to leave intact. It had to be broken down into manageable, controllable rules, the me, accessible only through the intermediaries of the new pantheon. This brings us to the profound mystery of the cycles. The Sumerian texts, when viewed through the lens of astronomical observation, are obsessed with cyclical recurrence. The orbital periods of celestial bodies, the predictable return of the sky disk, Nibiru, and the predictable pattern of great floods and resets. It is plausible that the pre-Anunnaki civilization did not simply collapse. Rather, it reached the end of a vast, scheduled cycle. The Anunnaki, perhaps, were not pure invaders, but rather the administrators of the Earth's temporal boundaries, cosmic estate managers who arrived to execute a preordained protocol of renewal and memory wipe. They didn't just erase the previous civilization. They executed a formal decommissioning, preparing the planetary system for the next phase of its cosmic rotation. But who were the silent witnesses now to this massive change? The texts offer fleeting glimpses of entities positioned above the fray, entities often grouped under the collective term igigi, or watchers. These were divine beings, often described as stationed in the upper atmosphere or in remote orbiting stations, who refused the physical labor assigned to the lower-ranking Anunnaki when they first arrived on Earth. These watchers may have been the true inheritors of the previous cycle's knowledge, keepers of the true history that was being systematically discarded. Their subsequent rebellion and integration into, or perhaps ostracization from, the Anunnaki structure, a theme that develops heavily in later Mesopotamian and Hebrew texts, might be directly related to their possession of inconvenient truths, the unedited chronicles of the time before. They saw the erasure happen, understood the mechanisms of the temporal reset, and their subsequent descent might have been their attempt to preserve fragments of that forbidden knowledge by intervening directly with humanity. The enduring mythos, which permeates subsequent cultures, speaks of a glorious, technologically sublime golden age preceding the current struggle. This is the inheritance of mud that we examine today. The early Sumerian settlements, rising rapidly from the Neolithic state, appear to be built upon a foundation of borrowed wisdom. They possessed advanced astronomical charts, sophisticated mathematical systems, sexagesimal, and agricultural planning that seemed too sudden, too fully formed for an indigenous emergence. This sudden leap suggests the transfer of a highly concentrated data package, the essential operational knowledge required for civilization, delivered in a rush to the newly installed human proxies. But this data was purposefully incomplete. It was the user manual for operation, carefully stripped of the philosophical and technological source code that would allow humanity to truly replicate or understand the power of the previous civilization. This incompleteness is the scar of the erasure. We are left grasping for the context that ties together the disparate fragments, the inexplicable global megalithic structures, the sudden appearance of advanced metallurgy, and the repeated motif of the serpent or dragon teaching fundamental truths. These fragments are echoes bouncing off the view walls of nonlinear time. If the pre-Anunnaki existence operated on a different vibrational or dimensional level, perhaps existing simultaneously or sequentially in a cycle far exceeding our current 26,000-year precession, then the act of erasing was less about physical demolition and more about shifting the planetary frequency, rendering the previous era invisible or inaccessible to the newly tuned human perception. We are trapped in a lower fidelity bandwidth of reality, one specifically calibrated for control and limited intellectual freedom under the Anunnaki directive. The unsettling question remains: if the Anunnaki systematically erased the memory of a previous, more advanced world to establish their rule, what protocols did they put in place to manage the end of their own cycle? The Sumerian texts, in their relentless focus on astronomical determinism, hint not only at the past, but at a looming return, a future reset. The very purpose of documenting the pre-flood king lists, even in their exaggerated form, was perhaps to serve as a coded warning. History will repeat itself. The rules of the present era are temporary, contingent upon the orbiting schedule of celestial observers and the fulfillment of cosmic mandates. The greatest secret, buried beneath the dust of Ur and Uruk, might not be what was erased, but the precise knowledge of how to survive the next programmed obsolescence, the next great calibration. If this exploration into the layers of historical omission and the mechanisms of cosmic cycles has stirred your own intellectual deep dive, if you recognize the pattern of strategic forgetting, then let us solidify this connection. For those who have stayed with us through this dense exploration, who are not content with the surface explanations, your insight is vital. We are uncovering something massive, and your intellectual commitment fuels this investigative journey. Please signal your dedication by subscribing to the channel and tapping the like button. Then, join the conversation below and share your thoughts. Comment the exact phrase, the obsidian gap. This phrase connects us directly to the silence that holds the greatest secrets. Do not move from this space. The next part of this narrative is crucial, for we will finally turn the lens onto the specific forbidden knowledge, the power source, that the Anunnaki feared most. Click on the video now appearing on your screen to continue the unraveling of the ancient Sumerian text. What we are tracking when we speak of the Sumerian texts and the history preceding the Anunnaki dominion is not merely a gap in the timeline, but the evidence of a deliberate silence. It is the vast, echoing space between paragraphs where the most crucial chapters were meant to be. If the arrival of the Anunnaki marked the beginning of recorded structured civilization, the era of kingship, irrigation, and debt, then the age that preceded it was the great unknown, the foundational bedrock that had to be pulverized and smoothed over so that the new foundation could be laid without resistance. Think of it not as an accidental loss through time and decay, but as a meticulous act of architectural erasure, where the blueprints of the former structure were systematically gathered and incinerated, ensuring that future generations would only ever look upon the resulting edifice and assume it was the original design. The deepest secret is not found in the cuneiform tablets that survived, detailing the labors and demands of the new rulers, but in the glaring absence, the sophisticated blankness where vibrant narratives ought to have been carved. This deliberate silence, this damnatio memoriae on a planetary scale, suggests a level of premeditation and strategic capability far beyond simple conquest. It implies that the pre-existing civilization posed not a physical threat to the Anunnaki, but an ideological or energetic one. Perhaps the greatest danger to a new ruling class is the memory of a society that lived differently, a society that operated outside the parameters of control and hierarchy they intended to impose. This civilization, the one that faded into the shadows just before the rise of the celestial observers, might have held the key to a form of consciousness, an understanding of physics, or a connection to the planet's resonance that made the Anunnaki system of resource extraction and rigid authority utterly obsolete. They wiped the slate clean, not because they couldn't coexist, but because the mere memory of the alternative would have rendered their rule precarious. The surviving texts hint at beings who were once closer to the source, whose golden age was not mythological fiction, but a historical period characterized by a distinct relationship with existence, a relationship that was terminated when the sky-faring beings descended. The Great Flood narratives, common across nearly every culture, serve not only as a record of catastrophe, but perhaps as the psychological tool used to mark the final, irreversible boundary between before and after. The water washed away the cities, yes, but the trauma of the deluge, the shared historical panic, washed away the memory. And so, as we navigate these broken pieces of clay and decode the whispering implications, we must pause and consider the sheer magnitude of this historical revision. If this journey into the erased history holds significance for you, if these echoes resonate in the quiet of your mind, then join the growing number of observers who seek these answers. A simple interaction, a like, a comment expressing your deepest thought on the concept of erased cycles, acts as a signal to the algorithm, ensuring this quiet investigation continues to reach those prepared to look beyond the accepted narrative. We are seeking the signature of a civilization that vanished, whose disappearance was a necessary precursor for the Anunnaki project to succeed. The mechanism of this erasure was not instantaneous, but rather layered, much like the process of constructing a long-term lie. Before the full implementation of the new order, there must have been a precursor signal, a recognized astronomical or geological event known to both the inhabitants of Earth and the approaching star travelers. Ancient texts, when read outside the traditional academic constraints, suggest cyclical cataclysms tied to the alignment of distant celestial bodies, a return that heralds not just destruction, but transformation and replacement. This signal may have been the moment the old inhabitants knew their time was ending, and the moment the Anunnaki knew the planetary canvas was ready for their mural. The texts frequently speak of great spans of time, the Sars and the Shars, intervals that dwarf our conventional historical understanding. These vast chronological markers emphasize the scale of the operation. The erasure was not a momentary act of malice, but the conclusion of a cosmological timing mechanism. The old world was dying not solely by conquest, but by cosmic schedule, a massive turnover facilitated and accelerated by the new arrivals. This brings us directly to the nature of the lost inheritance. What exactly was lost? We are often tempted to think in terms of physical technologies, flying machines or energy sources, but the deeper implication is the loss of wisdom concerning energetic harmony. If the pre-Anunnaki peoples existed in a state of high vibration or alignment with the Earth's natural magnetic field, their society would have been inherently incompatible with the material, resource-driven demands of the incoming rulers. Their inheritance might have been a deep intuitive knowledge of how to operate without control, without scarcity, and without the need for hierarchical mediation. This knowledge, far more dangerous than any weapon, had to be removed. The deliberate breaking down of communication systems, as symbolized in the Tower of Babel myth, is perhaps an allegory for the breaking down of a unified, high-frequency consciousness, fragmented into dissonant languages to prevent the easy sharing of the prohibited knowledge. This fragmentation ensured the inhabitants would never again operate as a singular, unified threat to the newcomers. The consequences of this overwrite resonate even today, hidden within the veil of mythology. The stories we dismiss as mere folklore, tales of gods manipulating humans, of forbidden knowledge, and of great cosmic battles, are, in essence, the distorted fragments of the suppressed history. The Sumerian accounts themselves, while foundational, are the Anunnaki interpretation of events. They are the official historical records sanctioned by the victors. The true challenge for the modern investigator is to read through the glorification and past, the self-serving declarations of the ruling gods, seeking the genuine grief and resistance embedded in the minor character narratives. It is here that we encounter the controversial figures of the role of the observers, often referred to as the Igigi or watchers. These were, perhaps, the intermediary class, the beings who remained on Earth while the Anunnaki royalty arrived. The texts paint a complicated picture. They were laborers, but also knowledgeable, capable of seeing the transition unfold. Were they the ones tasked with enforcing the erasure, or were they the final tragic resistance? Their rebellion, documented in various ways, suggests they retained some residual loyalty or attachment to the former order, perhaps horrified by the complete destruction of the indigenous knowledge systems. Their eventual marginalization and punishment served as a stern lesson. Absolute conformity was required for survival under the new regime. The Igigi were the witnesses who were subsequently silenced or corrupted, their story twisted into tales of fallen angels who tempted humanity with technology, turning the act of knowledge preservation into a crime. This leads to the concept of the temporal overwrite. The Anunnaki didn't just write a new chapter, they edited the core source code of the planet's consciousness. They established new cycles of time, new definitions of reality, and most importantly, new limits on human potential. The Sumerian tablets become crucial here, not just for what they state, but for the inherent worldview they propagate. A deterministic reality ruled by capricious gods, where human existence is defined by hard labor and obedience. This replaced a reality hinted at in the pre-flood memory, one where humans supposedly coexisted or collaborated with advanced beings on a footing closer to equality. The overwrite was successful because it was total, creating an environment where the very idea of the preceding Golden Age seemed like fantastical nonsense, an impossible dream. The terrifying implication embedded in this temporal shift is the anxiety of the cycle. If the pre-Anunnaki civilization was erased due to a cosmic timing mechanism, a return, then the current civilization, the one operating under the established Anunnaki system, is also subject to that same cyclical pressure. The texts often speak of the fragility of the current arrangement, the eventual coming of the great destructive fire, or the return of the old gods. This suggests that the current ruling era is finite, merely a phase in an infinitely repeating pattern of construction, exploitation, erasure, and replacement. The Anunnaki themselves may be merely caretakers of a specific historical moment, bound by the larger, terrifying clockwork of the cosmos. This awareness of impending collapse generates an undercurrent of anxiety throughout the ancient narratives, a fear that history does not move forward, but simply spins on an axis of destruction and rebirth. When we examine the actual clay artifacts, we are left with the fragmented language. So many tablets are broken, incomplete, or defy easy translation. We must question whether this fragmentation is merely the result of millennia in the ground, or whether the remaining evidence was deliberately preserved in a fractured state. A partial truth is often more misleading than a complete lie. These surviving slivers, mentions of long rains, of strange metallic objects, of communication with the stars before the descent, are the momentary disturbances in the smooth surface of the rewritten history. They are the cracks through which we glimpse the light of the forgotten world. We must train ourselves to see the significance in the gaps, to treat the missing pieces as proof of concealment, rather than accidents of time. This journey demands the unsettling recognition. The patterns observed in the ancient texts are disturbingly familiar. The control of resources, the imposition of manufactured scarcity, the systemic fragmentation of society, and the constant rewriting of history to suit the current rulers. These are not unique to Sumeria. If the Anunnaki performed a grand erasure to implement their version of reality, then the underlying mechanics of that control system might still be operational, simply adapting to the modern technological environment. The biggest challenge is accepting that the structure of the world we inhabit today might be an inherited system, a meticulously maintained continuation of that initial overwrite. If you have stayed with this line of inquiry, if you feel the weight of this history pressing down through the millennia, then you are ready for the next level of investigation. We are not just viewers, we are decipherers, seeking the true frequency beneath the noise. If this deep dive into the cycles of erasure holds meaning for you, please take a moment now, subscribe to the channel, ensuring you receive the immediate notification for the next critical installment. Like this video, confirming that this pursuit of esoteric knowledge is vital, and most importantly, comment below with this specific phrase: "The silence is the proof." This signal will bind our community of hidden history researchers. The next part will address the direct consequences of the Anunnaki regime's greatest deception, the systematic altering of human memory itself. The evidence is waiting. Join me there. What if the most profound history is not what was overtly destroyed, but what was systematically and silently allowed to decay into irrelevance? We have spent countless hours poring over the Sumerian fragments that speak volumes about the arrival and the reign of the Anunnaki, detailing their lineage, their objectives, and their complex relationships with humanity. Yet the real revelation, the uneasy truth whispered between the cracked lines of the clay tablets, resides in the information that isn't there, in the historical narrative that was carefully truncated right at the moment of their ascent to power. It is the story of the great historical pivot, the moment when the understanding of time itself seems to have been hijacked. The texts that precede the absolute dominance of the Anunnaki speak of cosmic cycles not merely as astronomical events, but as a living, breathing mechanism of terrestrial consciousness. They paint a picture of an Earth profoundly different from the resource-rich but spiritually impoverished planet the Anunnaki seem to inherit. There was a sophisticated recognition of the relationship between energy, resonance, and the great celestial clockwork, a knowing that placed humanity not as servants waiting for instruction, but as highly attuned participants in the universal rhythm. This perspective, this deep-seated sense of cyclical time, is what seems to have been the first and most crucial casualty of the new regime. To control a populace, one must first control their perception of destiny. If the people believe in inevitable cycles of renewal and return, their motivation for endless labor and immediate gratification, which often fuels the mechanisms of control, is fundamentally undermined. The Anunnaki texts, by contrast, are intensely focused on linear progress, on the here and now, on the immediate extraction of gold, and on the establishment of rigid hierarchical structures. The past, before their arrival, became nothing more than a murky void, a necessary wilderness that preceded the supposed organization and wisdom they brought. This suppression was less about burning libraries and more about erasing the metaphysical memory of the species, a task far more insidious and effective than any military campaign. We are left with tantalizing yet elusive fragments, descriptions of technology that harness the ether, architectural styles attuned to harmonic frequencies, and an intimate familiarity with global energetic ley lines that suggests an advanced form of global connectivity, yet without the metallic infrastructure we associate with modern civilization. These fragments suggest a lineage of builders and thinkers, the silent observers who understood the ebb and flow of planetary time, and perhaps even possessed the knowledge of when the great cycles were set to shift. It makes one deeply uneasy to consider the possibility that what was erased was not just a history of human achievement, but the keys to circumventing the very systems of servitude that were subsequently imposed. If the ancients knew the precise timing of the return, a celestial or geophysical moment when planetary conditions shift dramatically, then their knowledge represented a fatal weakness in the Anunnaki's long-term plan for control. True erasure, then, becomes the intentional clouding of the calendar, the obfuscation of the star maps that pointed toward the future, ensuring that future generations would be perpetually adrift, unaware of the cosmic signals that might trigger an awakening or prompt a mass exodus from the established order. The deep memory that lingers suggests a time when communication with beings or intelligence outside our current three-dimensional consensus reality was not considered mythical, but operational. The Sumerian fragments hint at a prior covenant, a relationship with what we might call precursors, entities or energies that favored harmonious development over extractive enterprise. When the Anunnaki arrived, this prior covenant was dissolved, or perhaps forcibly overwritten. The shift involved more than just changing who sat on the throne. It involved altering the fundamental energetic contract between humanity and the earth. This radical change is the ghost we continue to chase through the Mesopotamian dust. Think of the vast oceans and the submerged ruins they hide, cities built not for defense, but for resonance. We look at the ruins of great civilizations today and marvel at their stones, yet we rarely consider what vital, non-physical components have been stripped away. The lost heritage isn't about mere structures, it's about the understanding of sound as form, light as transport, and vibration as communication. If the Anunnaki sought to establish a lasting, stable, and predictable source of labor and resources, they needed to standardize human thought and activity, moving it away from the unpredictable, high-frequency and highly individualistic consciousness that the precursor civilizations seemed to foster. The history that was erased, therefore, represents the last known instance of humanity operating outside a controlled laboratory environment. This fact alone should compel us to look closer, to question every conventional dating and every established narrative. The silence is deafening because it implies a perfection of historical manipulation that modern societies are only beginning to replicate. And this brings us back to the intricate clockwork of the cosmos. The most dangerous information, the most tightly guarded secret, relates to the nature of the great cycles themselves. We speak often of the precession of the equinoxes, but the true knowledge held by the silent observers went far deeper, linking celestial mechanics to seismic and climatic shifts, and crucially, to shifts in human awareness. The erased texts did not just record history, they provided a roadmap for escaping historical repetition. They offered the precise timing of the openings and closings of cosmic doors, windows of opportunity where the veil between dimensions thinned, allowing for profound technological or spiritual leaps. By obscuring this knowledge, the Anunnaki ensured that humanity would be perpetually caught in a loop of engineered scarcity and conflict, distracted by the immediate demands of existence, rather than preparing for the inevitable return of the larger cosmic configuration. This is not a history to be passively consumed. It demands active participation, reflection, and intellectual engagement. If the echoes of this profound realization that our past was intentionally crippled to secure our present subjugation resonate deep within your own intuition, pause for a moment. This shared journey is dependent on the critical mass of those who seek the obscured truth. If you find value in these relentless inquiries, in connecting these fragments of history, take a moment to join this gathering of observers. A simple like helps others find this path, and subscribing ensures you remain connected as we piece together the next crucial act in this drama. Share your deepest reflection in the comments below. Tell us, what specific piece of lost knowledge do you instinctively believe was the most important to erase? Your input is not merely engagement, it is the extension of this very investigation. The motive for this monumental erasure seems to extend beyond simple resource acquisition. It touches upon a profound desire to control fate itself. If the previous epoch possessed the observational capacity to predict the lifespan or the vulnerability of the Anunnaki's tenure on Earth, then erasing that knowledge was an act of self-preservation layered with tyranny. The silent observers, those who came before, understood that permanence is an illusion of three-dimensional existence. They saw time as a spiral, where similar conditions inevitably return, offering chances for correction or freedom. The Anunnaki's great historical achievement, from their perspective, was to flatten that spiral into a seemingly endless, monotonous line, where the future looks exactly like an extrapolation of the present, devoid of the unexpected liberation inherent in cosmic shifts. We see the architectural remnants of this erasure in the cultural artifacts we study today, the abrupt loss of sophisticated astronomical data among post-flood civilizations, the sudden necessity of labor systems built on fear rather than consensus, and the overwhelming focus on deities who demand tribute rather than fostering mutual understanding. This isn't just about forgetting. It's about a systematic campaign to inculcate a sense of smallness, of dependency, ensuring that humanity would forever look up to the masters for salvation, rather than within, to the inherent cosmic heritance that had been suppressed. The memory of the time before, a time when humanity walked autonomously alongside advanced understanding, is the critical gap in our collective psyche. As we prepare to transition into the next segment of this exploration, where we will examine the specific esoteric disciplines that suffered the most profound obliteration and the strange archaeological anomalies that refuse to fit the official timeline. Remember the weight of this silence. The Sumerian tablets reveal not just what happened, but what was prevented from happening. They serve as a cryptographic warning, signaling that the cycles are not truly broken, merely masked. The memory is dormant, not dead. The next turn of the key involves understanding the nature of the return signal that the Anunnaki tried so desperately to silence forever. What happens when the cosmic alignment forces the mask to fall? If you have stayed with this inquiry, if you feel the immense weight of the suppressed narrative resting upon your shoulders, then you are a true participant in this vital work. It is only by recognizing the intentional gaps in our history that we can begin to fill them. If this continuous pursuit of the deep truth resonates, please show your support by ensuring you are subscribed to the channel and give this video a like. To anchor this realization, I ask you to comment with the simple, powerful phrase, "I hear the echo." This phrase signifies that you recognize the subtle presence of the lost civilization whispering beneath the noise of our controlled history. Join us in the next chapter, which should now appear on your screen, as we delve into the final, harrowing details of the specific knowledge the Anunnaki eradicated to secure their rule, and the potential path for us to reclaim our forgotten heritage. What remains, when the historical record itself is the greatest work of fiction ever conceived? We have walked the shadowed corners of the Sumerian tablets, recognizing not merely gaps in the chronology, but deliberate voids, vast, echoing spaces where entire epochs of advanced civilization should stand. The terrifying implication is not that knowledge was lost to time, but that it was ruthlessly extracted, like a surgeon removing an inconvenient organ, ensuring that the patient, modern humanity, would survive the operation with no memory of what was taken. The Anunnaki arrival, as documented in the selective narratives that survived, was not a simple conquest of primitive people. It was an overlay, a systematic imposition of a new reality structure onto a substrate of profound spiritual intelligence. To achieve this dominion, they needed to ensure that the memory of the previous world was not just suppressed, but rendered conceptually impossible. This brings us to the core mechanism of the erasure, which was far more insidious than simple destruction of cuneiform. It was the manipulation of the very sense of time. Think of the cycles inherent in the oldest cosmological understandings, the turning of vast ages, the precession of the equinoxes, the recognition that civilizations rise and fall not in simple linear progression, but in recurring, predictable cosmic breaths. The civilization that preceded the Anunnaki, the inhabitants of the world before, operated within this cyclical understanding. Their achievements, their technologies, and their very existence were anchored in a profound harmony with these cosmic rhythms. When the Anunnaki established their reign, they did something revolutionary and tyrannical. They began the process of flattening time, enforcing a linear cause and effect narrative that emphasized beginning and end, effectively severing humanity's connection to the vast, recurring epochs of the past. The goal was to make the Anunnaki appear as the original, definitive creators, reducing the wisdom of the previous ages to mere folklore or the ramblings of primordial giants. The Sumerian king list offers us one of the most glaring, yet often dismissed, pieces of evidence for this chronological dissonance. We read of rulers before the flood reigning for tens of thousands of years, periods so extensive that they defy biological or conventional historical sense. Mainstream academia dismisses these reigns as mythic exaggeration or a misunderstanding of numerical systems. But what if those numbers were a literal, albeit compressed, recording of the transition? What if those incredibly long reigns were the final, lingering records of a time system that measured existence across entire cosmic cycles? A system that the incoming rulers gradually had to truncate, compress, and ultimately replace with the much shorter, more manageable historical framework we use today. The absurd length of those reigns might be the silent scream of the old system, an error code embedded in the new operating system, showing the sheer magnitude of the past that needed to be crammed into a recognizable, controllable timeline. Consider the societal implications of this imposed amnesia. If you remove a people's awareness of their cyclical heritage, their knowledge that the high watermarks of civilization have been reached and lost before, you extinguish their ability to envision a future different from the one currently dictated to them. They become perpetual children in a linear sandbox, eternally grateful for the tools and structures provided by the ruling authorities, never realizing that their ancestors wielded far greater, subtler powers, rooted in understanding the true, deep mechanics of the cosmos, not merely its superficial material expression. This cognitive restructuring is precisely why the fragments we uncover in the most obscure tablets carry such weight. They are the whispers that escape the systemic re-edit, the intellectual shrapnel of a world shattered not by natural forces, but by calculated ideological warfare. To truly grasp the scale of what was erased, we must continuously question the very foundation of our understanding of history. Is it possible that the historical narratives of great floods and divine interventions were merely the convenient cover story for the installation of the new paradigm? If the gravity of this deliberate chronological manipulation resonates within your own sense of historical intuition, if you feel that the official narrative is too neat, too convenient to be true, then you are engaging with the deep memory that the Anunnaki sought to stifle. Ponder this deeply, and if these whispered histories resonate, take a moment to engage with this journey. Let us know below what ancient truth feels most precarious to you, what piece of forgotten history you feel might be lurking just beneath the surface of the accepted chronology. Your insight and engagement are crucial, for only through this collective intellectual effort can we continue to peel back the layers of profound deception and ensure that this investigation continues to uncover these profound, unsettling layers of our obscured past. The survival of certain myths, those tenacious cultural seeds that refuse to wither under the scorching light of mandated history, serves as further proof of this cognitive war. Why do countless disparate cultures across the globe share stories of pre-human wisdom bringers, beings who taught mathematics, astronomy, and agriculture before the flood, or before the age of true civilization? These are the echoes of the erased world, transmuted through generations of retelling, forced to fit the new, simpler template of gods and men. The beings from the erased epoch, which we often label dismissively as primordial deities or giants, were perhaps simply the last living testaments to a different kind of humanity, one not constrained by the materialistic and scarcity-driven frameworks imposed later. Their memory survives, but it is distorted, draped in the garments of superstition, because the truth was too complex, too challenging to the new ruler's authority. When we look at the figure of Enki, or Ea in the Anunnaki pantheon, a recurring ambiguity emerges. He's often portrayed as the benevolent trickster, the creator who warns humanity of impending doom. But within the framework of the erase, Enki's role shifts from simple divine benefactor to perhaps a compromised insider, a figure who either chose or was forced to negotiate the transition. The texts are vague enough to allow for two readings. Either he genuinely cared for his creation, humanity, or he was tasked with managing the narrative transition, preserving just enough memory of the past world, the secrets of craft and knowledge, to ensure the continuity of labor, but not enough to challenge the new hierarchy. The very knowledge that was passed down, the foundational sciences of Sumer, may not have been an Anunnaki invention at all, but a curated inheritance stolen from the civilization that preceded them, rebranded as the gifts of the new gods. This selective preservation of technology, while simultaneously destroying the philosophical and spiritual understanding that underpinned it, is the hallmark of the successful erase. It's the difference between being given a highly advanced car and being given the knowledge of how to build and maintain the entire industrial complex that created it. The Sumerians received the car, astronomy, writing, city planning, but they were deliberately denied the keys to the engine, the comprehension of the cyclical cosmic consciousness that their predecessors mastered. This deliberate intellectual amputation ensured compliance. The notion of the Great Reset thus becomes far more ominous than a metaphor. The catastrophic events that ended the antediluvian world were potentially orchestrated or, at the very least, utilized as a crucial opportunity for the final phase of the cognitive erasure. When the waters receded, the physical evidence of the old world was buried under miles of sediment and chaos. But equally important, the psychological landscape was primed for the narrative of a fresh start. Humanity, traumatized and desperate, would readily accept any authority that promised order and survival, even if that order came with an iron fist and a completely fabricated history. The Anunnaki didn't just walk onto the stage. They demanded that the audience forget the entire preceding play. But if the entire historical backdrop was systematically cleared, how could the Sumerian scribes themselves possess the residual memories that we are now uncovering? The answer might lie in the role of the Igigi, the so-called Watchers, or lower-ranking Anunnaki, who seem to have been present for much longer, perhaps even interacting with the preceding civilization. These entities, often depicted as growing restless or even rebellious against the main Anunnaki command, may have been the conduits through which fragments of the true, unedited history slipped into the record. Their presence suggests that the Anunnaki regime was not monolithic. There were dissenters, observers, those who perhaps saw the tragedy of the erase and encoded silent warnings, like intellectual time capsules, within the tablets they were tasked with cataloguing. To search for these discrepancies, to dedicate oneself to uncovering the nature of the world before the Anunnaki rule, is to commit a historical heresy. It is to challenge the official origin story of civilization itself, a story that has been reinforced by millennia of repetition and archaeological convenience. We are not just debating dates and locations, we are questioning the fundamental premise of human subservience. The deep, unsettling realization is that our current historical epoch, the one we call civilization, may only be the controlled, curated aftermath of a much grander, older and wiser time. The enduring silence around these specific topics, the pre-Anunnaki technology, the true meaning of the long king list reigns, the identity of the wisdom bringers, is deafening. It is a calculated silence, maintained not by a lack of evidence, but by a powerful, perhaps ongoing, suppression of perspective. The lingering question is, were the Anunnaki merely utilizing a natural cosmic cycle, like a pole shift or a catastrophic flood, to cement their control? Or did they possess the capability to actively trigger the global upheaval necessary for their clean historical slate? If the latter is true, the implications for our present existence are chilling, suggesting a level of technological and geopolitical control that transcends our modern understanding of power. This journey is far from over. We have only begun to chart the periphery of the erased kingdom. We have seen the shadows of the ancient wisdom and felt the profound weight of the forgotten truth. But to truly understand the scope of the Anunnaki control, we must dive deeper into the coded warnings left by the dissenting watchers and examine the true nature of the cosmic clock they attempted to dismantle. If you have stayed with us through this dense exploration, if you recognize the gravity of what we are collectively uncovering, then you understand that this is more than just a historical documentary. It is a shared excavation of the human psyche. If the prospect of retrieving these critical lost memories compels you forward, I urge you to join this endeavor permanently. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel, ensuring you receive the final crucial parts of this investigation. Give this video a like if these profound questions fuel your own curiosity, and signal your commitment by commenting the phrase, "The cycle must break." The next phase of our journey will focus on the specific, coded mechanisms the Anunnaki used to prevent the return of the cyclical memory. Do not miss it. The next video on your screen holds the key to the deepest suppression. What happens to a civilization when its memory is not simply lost, but actively, systemically silenced? We are not speaking of the natural decay of stone and papyrus over millennia. We are speaking of an intentional void, a deliberate amputation performed upon the timeline of Earth itself. The Sumerian accounts, as we painstakingly dissect them, reveal the astonishing implication that the Anunnaki did not merely arrive and begin to rule. They arrived and initiated a vast cosmic maintenance protocol designed to scrub clean the slate of previous self-sufficient human development. This is where the story shifts from archaeology to existential dread, forcing us to consider that the history we accept is merely the authorized prologue to a much larger, disturbing drama. The greatest power exerted by the self-proclaimed rulers was not their advanced technology, nor their impressive stature, but their absolute, unchallenged authority over the historical narrative, dictating what was to be remembered and what was condemned to complete oblivion. We must now confront the mechanism of this forgetting. It was multifaceted, encompassing not just the destruction of physical structures, the magnificent cities and libraries of the antediluvian age, but a far more insidious psychological and genetic pruning. Imagine an advanced species possessing the knowledge of cosmic cycles and the precise architecture of consciousness, choosing to implement a form of spiritual amnesia upon the nascent species they sought to govern. The erased information, the knowledge that granted the pre-Anunnaki civilizations their independence and technological parity, was not simply forgotten through time. It was rendered unthinkable within the new human cognitive framework. The texts suggest that the earliest generations post-reset struggled with a profound sense of temporal vertigo, an inability to reconcile the sudden simplicity of their new lives. Agriculture, basic irrigation, the worship of powerful deities, with the ghostly whisper of a time when they commanded the very forces of nature. This profound estrangement from their own deeper past is the first sign of successful cosmic censorship. The unsettling recognition that dawns from these fragmented clay tablets is that the Anunnaki functioned less as simple kings and more as sophisticated observers, not just recording history, but editing it in real time. Their rule established a rigid cyclical pattern, a pattern intrinsically linked to the great celestial clock, the return of Nibiru. This cycle provided the opportune window, the catastrophic moment of planetary upheaval, through which the historical reset could be executed with minimum resistance. The flood, therefore, was not merely a natural disaster exploited for political gain. It was the ultimate cosmic tool of erasure, a meticulously timed event that provided perfect cover for the removal of all competing narratives. The silence that followed was not merely the sound of a devastated world rebuilding, but the sound of history being dictated anew, line by line on damp clay tablets under the watchful eyes of their new patrons. Every subsequent law, every dictated myth, every genealogy traced back to the new ruling dynasty served as a nail in the coffin of the previous epoch, ensuring that the heritage art of true self-determination remained buried beneath layers of imposed reverence and obedience. This meticulously constructed oblivion raises an unsettling parallel. If they erased the past to secure their rule, Were they not also setting the stage for future eras of intentional amnesia? We are looking at the blueprint for control that transcends simple political subjugation. It is the control of evolutionary potential itself. The inherent danger of the erased knowledge was that it contained the keys to transcending the limitations imposed upon post-reset humanity, the genetic and intellectual barriers implemented to ensure compliance and productivity in the mines and fields. The texts hint at specific sciences that were targeted for immediate suppression, sciences related to zero-point energy, atmospheric manipulation, and perhaps most crucially, the direct connection between human consciousness and the deeper fabric of reality, the very power utilized by the gods themselves. To allow humanity to retain that knowledge would be akin to giving the workers the keys to the kingdom, undermining the entire rationale of the Anunnaki mission. The uneasiness settles when we realize that our current scientific quests might not be toward new discoveries, but merely the painstaking, piece-by-piece rediscovery of what was intentionally destroyed long ago, a ghost archive waiting to be reactivated. If this deep dive into the architecture of cosmic censorship resonates with you, if the sensation of realizing that our collective memory has been curated sparks a burning need to know more, I encourage you to pause for a moment and consider the gravity of this discovery. Are we truly meant to be the first generation to understand that oblivion is an active agent, not a passive consequence? If you are tracking the complex threads of this narrative, the cycles, the lost knowledge, the pervasive control, then take a moment now to let us know that you are following this journey intently. A simple like helps signal this deep investigative effort to others who seek these truths, and subscribing ensures you don't miss the final, most crucial parts of this revelation. Your engagement is the countermeasure against the very forces of forgetting we are discussing. Let us return to the specifics of the suppression. It required more than just the destruction of records. It required the systematic removal of the keepers of those records. The lineage of antediluvian kings and sages, those who possessed the vast, unimaginable lifespans and the direct memory of the pre-reset world, represented walking libraries of dissent. These were the individuals the Anunnaki had to neutralize, not through simple execution, but through mythologizing their removal, transforming them from dangerous custodians of truth into mythical figures, the heroes of an unreachable past, thereby insulating the new generations from the dangerous reality of their direct relevance. The few surviving references in the king lists, those strange, impossibly long reigns, are not fanciful exaggeration. They are the censored acknowledgement of individuals who lived across the cycles, who remembered the truth before it was replaced by the imposed reality of subservience. They are the signal that something immense was sacrificed to birth the current historical age. The sheer scale of this operation speaks to a cosmic level of paranoia, or perhaps more accurately, cosmic resource management. The knowledge held by the pre-Anunnaki civilizations was, in essence, a non-renewable resource, the power to interact directly with the planet without the need for intermediaries. By erasing this knowledge, the Anunnaki ensured their own indispensable status. They became the sole providers of advanced understanding, filtering scientific and technological progress through the lens of their own hierarchy and objectives. This created a dependency loop, a cognitive cage from which early humanity could not escape. The slow, painful advancement of technology in the Sumerian era, juxtaposed with the instantaneous technological achievements attributed to the Anunnaki themselves, perfectly illustrates this deliberate bottleneck. It shows a carefully calibrated release of information, just enough to facilitate tasks, never enough to empower independent thought. This pattern, this architecture of intentional oblivion, finds echoes across diverse global myths, suggesting that the Sumerian texts are not an isolated account, but the clearest articulation of a universal historical trauma. The stories of the Watchers teaching forbidden arts, only for those arts to be violently suppressed by higher celestial powers, the sudden shift from the Golden Age to the Age of Bronze. These are not coincidences. They are the fragmented, culture-specific attempts to remember the moment when the cosmic curriculum was changed, when the human experiment was forcibly downgraded from co-creators to subjects. The implication is staggering. The greatest civilizations lost are not merely beneath the sands, but conceptually locked away, deemed too powerful, too destabilizing for the current cosmic order maintained by the Anunnaki and their apparatus. But the nature of memory is tenacious. Just as a severed nerve sometimes sends phantom signals, the collective consciousness retains traces of the erased past, manifesting as intuitive knowledge, sudden breakthroughs, or recurring archetypes of great forgotten kings and magnificent sunken cities. These subtle whispers are the fault lines in the imposed reality, the small cracks through which the light of the antediluvian era filters. And this is the focus of our final consideration. The cyclical nature of the universe guarantees that every returned of Nibiru brings with it the risk of historical reactivation. The moment of greatest upheaval is also the moment of greatest vulnerability for the censorship system. If the erased knowledge survives in any physical or energetic form, the return cycle represents the opportunity for a massive, uncontrolled download of the suppressed files. The texts, therefore, are not merely historical records, they are potential catalysts. By reading and internalizing them, we are effectively bypassing the intentional amnesia protocol, dusting off the dangerous, foundational truths that the Anunnaki worked so hard to bury. We are preparing for the Kenk's signal, the next great celestial alignment that may reveal not just the depth of their rule, but the true magnitude of what was sacrificed to establish it. We must now turn our attention to the final, most profound questions. What specific secrets did the Anunnaki fear most, and what is the current subtle mechanism they employ in our modern age to ensure that the memory of the cycles remains just beyond our conscious grasp? If you have stayed with us through this unsettling journey, navigating the deepest trenches of historical suppression, you are now part of a unique few who understand the true stakes of this investigation. If you recognize that we are decoding a history that was meant to remain hidden, then solidify your place in this lineage of remembrance. Ensure you are subscribed to the channel, giving us the support necessary to continue this work. Please give this video a full like, reinforcing its presence against the prevailing tide of superficiality. And crucially, I ask you to comment below with the phrase, "The signal awaits." This simple comment acts as a marker, showing us who is truly ready for the final defining revelation. The truth of what was erased is about to come into sharper focus in our next segment, as we prepare to examine the ultimate price paid for the Anunnaki's undisputed reign. Join us for the final part of this investigation, appearing on your screen now. Was the true cost of history simply the silence that followed the deluge? As we reach the terminal point of this relentless investigation into the depths, do not ask what the Sumerian texts revealed to us, but rather what the texts demanded that we forget. What ultimate price was exacted for the stability of the Anunnaki administration? And how deeply rooted is the institutionalized amnesia that allows for the maintenance of their ancient hierarchy? This final arc demands that we look past the king's lists and the carefully constructed genealogies, past the spectacular descriptions of the Igigi and the metallic sky chariots, and focus instead on the empty space, the deafening void surrounding the epoch that preceded their arrival. If the foundation of a new world order requires the complete spiritual and intellectual neutering of the previous tenant, then the Great Erasure was not merely an event of physical destruction. It was a psychological operation of cosmic scale, an architectural decision designed to lock future consciousness into a specific narrow bandwidth of possibility. We have traced the fragile, flickering fragments of this memory through the echoes in the clay, identifying the subtle linguistic shifts and the sudden, unexplained breaks in technological and moral development. But the conclusion, the true final consequence, is chillingly simple. The Anunnaki did not merely rule the earth. They fundamentally redefined what being human meant. They did not just seize control of resources, they seized control of narrative. The most precious resource was not gold, but the free, unbound knowledge of our own multidimensional heritage, the very truth that affirmed our intrinsic parity, perhaps even superiority, to those who arrived from the stars. This realization is the final hinge upon which the entire narrative swings. The reason for the meticulous record-keeping, the insistence on their own divinity, the establishment of temples dedicated to awe and fear, was to ensure that the memory of the pre-diluvian, self-governed, spiritually sovereign human faded into the realm of myth and superstition, where it could be safely dismissed by any future archaeologist or skeptic. Think of the lingering sense of unease, the existential dread that permeates modern society, the feeling that we are fundamentally operating at a fraction of our potential. If the Sumerian narrative, stripped of its imposed theological layers, points to a time when humanity was not seeking salvation from above, but operating from a position of inherent, advanced understanding, then perhaps the deep-seated anxiety of the 21st century is not merely a byproduct of technology, but a collective, generational grief for a lost capacity, a phantom limb of consciousness severed during the transition to the Anunnaki age. It is the echo of the forgotten truth, a signal buried deep within our DNA, whispering that the current cycle is merely an interruption, a deviation from a grander, more harmonious trajectory. This signal is powerful, often misinterpreted as spiritual longing or philosophical abstraction, but it is, in fact, historical memory attempting to resurface. We must pause here, on the precipice of this ultimate recognition, and consider the weight of this implication. If the suppression of this truth is the cornerstone of the past 5,000 years of recorded history, then the act of truly seeing and discussing this suppressed epoch becomes an act of defiant intellectual sovereignty. This knowledge, meticulously pieced together from the margins of ancient scripts, is not meant to be passively consumed. It demands active participation, reflection, and debate. If these ideas resonate within the quiet corners of your mind, if you feel the unfamiliar rhythm of this ancient signal beginning to synchronize with your own understanding, then I urge you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Let us use this space, not for simple affirmation, but for true intellectual engagement, perhaps suggesting the forgotten words or phrases you believe might be key to unlocking the rest of this vast, submerged history. This journey requires commitment, and if you are dedicated to uncovering these layers of intentional forgetting, ensuring you are subscribed and engaged with this channel is the most vital step in keeping this flame of inquiry burning bright. The structure of control, we now understand, was cemented not by overwhelming force, though that was certainly used, but by the imposition of a cyclical pattern. The Anunnaki established themselves as the ultimate authorities, the great shepherds of a bewildered flock. But what happens when the flock begins to look back, not just at the shepherds, but at the empty fields beyond the enclosure? The erasure was completed with the Great Flood, a catastrophic event that served two critical functions. First, the obliteration of the existing physical evidence, and second, the psychological trauma that rendered the survivors desperate and pliable. In the immediate aftermath, any surviving memories of independent capability would have been drowned out by the sheer struggle for survival and the overwhelming need for guidance from the gods who supposedly rescued them or foresaw the disaster. The flood became the ultimate system reset, wiping the hard drive of civilization clean, allowing the Anunnaki to install their operating system of veneration and obedience. This leads us to the heart of the climax, the profound yet easily overlooked realization of human resilience. Even in the face of such comprehensive erasure, the fragments survived. They survived in the very texts meant to glorify the conquerors. They survived in the strange high mythologies of disparate cultures that speak of golden ages abruptly ended. They survived in the symbolic structures of megalithic sites whose purpose defied the technological understanding of the subsequent Sumerian epoch. These remnants are the signposts left by the great observers, perhaps not extraterrestrial beings, but the spiritual ancestors of humanity who understood the mechanics of cosmic cycles and the inevitability of the return. They encoded the knowledge not in easily destroyable archives, but in patterns, mathematics, and monumental architecture designed to withstand the coming catastrophe. If the Anunnaki ruled based on a lie, the lie of human inherent subservience, then the power of the suppressed truth is immense. We are not fundamentally slaves to gold mines or servants to celestial taskmasters. The texts, read backwards through the lens of intentional deletion, suggest that the true heritage of humanity is one of vast spiritual aptitude, perhaps capable of traversing dimensions or harnessing energies that made the Anunnaki themselves seem merely technologically advanced rather than truly divine. The fear of the rulers was precisely this: that humanity would reclaim its memory and recognize the limitations of its current governors. Consider the notion of cycles, which is so central to ancient cosmology. The Sumerian tablets speak of vast, incomprehensible timeframes, often connected to celestial movements, particularly the return of the planet associated with the Anunnaki. If they are periodic visitors, rulers who maintain their dominion in cycles, then the current era is simply one phase of their control. The question then becomes, what is the signal that marks the end of their established order? It is not an external planetary event. It is the internal collective awakening of humanity, the recognition that the historical narrative is a forged document. The moment we collectively remember what was erased, the sovereignty, the self-governance, the boundless potential, that moment marks the true end of the Anunnaki's long, silent rule. The forgetting was their power. The memory is our liberation. This investigation, stretching across 8 parts and delving into the deepest recesses of ancient clay and modern interpretation, brings us to the synthesis of all these elements. We stand today at a cross-section of history, armed with technology that allows us to re-examine the silent gaps and deliberate omissions in the archaeological record. The great existential anxieties of our time, the search for purpose, the question of consciousness, the fear of environmental collapse, might all be rooted in this enforced amnesia. We are seeking answers to questions that were already answered in the era before the Anunnaki arrived. We are trying to invent what was deliberately uninvented. The final echo of the Sumerian text, the truth etched into the void of the erasure, is a testament to the persistent power of the human spirit to remember. It reminds us that knowledge cannot be truly destroyed, only hidden. The Anunnaki may have ruled the physical world, constructed the narrative, and dictated the terms of our existence, but they could never fully extinguish the potential that resided in the core of our being. The inherent connection to the source of all things, the very thing that made the pre-Anunnaki civilization so dangerous to their ambition. This is the conclusion, but it is not an end. It is merely the opening of a new chapter in self-investigation. If you have journeyed through this entire narrative, felt the unsettling quiet of the erased history, and recognized the magnitude of what has been kept from us, then you are now part of a critical community of observers. If you have stayed with us until this very moment, recognizing the threads of truth woven into the fabric of this deep dive, then your commitment is invaluable to the continuation of this research. We invite you to formalize that commitment. Please take a moment now to subscribe to the channel, ensuring you receive immediate notification of our next deep dive investigation. If this extensive look into the erased era has offered you a new perspective, show your support by liking this video. And finally, to mark your presence in this discovery, comment below with this specific phrase: "I choose to remember the signal." This phrase is a psychological marker, an affirmation that you recognize the importance of the truth buried in the clay. The Sumerian texts, once silent archives, have now spoken their final warning and their ultimate hope. The screen will now transition to the next part of our ongoing research, a natural progression from this definitive conclusion. Continue your journey with us. The deeper mysteries await those willing to look beyond the approved narrative.